Did you know that there is a single configuration that gives you complete artistic control over your depth of field and automatically protects against motion blur and even ensures you never miss a fleeting moment again? Almost nobody talks about how to set it up properly. Well, hey, I'm Steve, and let's get into it. Here's a scenario almost every photographer goes through. Standing on a busy street, the light is changing fast, and an incredible fleeting moment happens right in front of you. You raise your camera, but instead of flicking the shutter, your thumb starts to pan across three different dials: shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO. Now, by the time you get your light center meter centered, the moment is gone. The person's turned away, and you're left holding a camera full of missed opportunities. Now, we've all been sold the exact same myth when starting out that real photographers only shoot in manual mode. We treat manual mode like a badge of honor, as if relying on anything automatic makes us purely amateur. But here's the brutal truth: manual mode isn't making you a better photographer, especially if it's causing you to miss that shot. Now, think of your camera like a high end performance sports car. Manual mode is like driving a stick shift where you also have to manually pump the fuel line and adjust the air intake with your hand still trying to steer. Sure, you've got 100% control of the vehicle, but your brain power is spent trying to keep that car running rather than actually watching the road. Now, what if you could hand off the tedious rapid fire calculations to a lightning fast processor inside your camera, all the while keeping absolute creative control on how the image actually looks? That's where the power combo of aperture priority and auto ISO comes in. It's not a shortcut, and it's definitely not cheating. It's the exact workflow high-level working pros use to stay fast, fluid, and focused on composition. So how do we actually set this up without losing control of our images? Well, let's break this down in the first half of the equation. Here's where it gets interesting. Out of the three pillars of exposure, aperture, shutter, speed, and ISO, only one of them fundamentally dictates the artistic character and depth in your frame. That's your aperture. When you choose an aperture, you're the one deciding the story of the photograph. Are you shooting a portrait at f1.2 or f1.8 to completely isolate your subject with that buttery out of focus background? Or are you shooting a street architecture at 1.8 to keep every single detail crisp from the foreground back to the horizon? When you switch your camera mode dial to aperture priority, marked by either an A or an AV on most cameras, you tell the camera, hey, look, I'm the artist. I decide the depth of field. You figure out the rest. Imagine you're at a sports event or walking through a fast-paced market. In full manual mode, every time you step away from the bright sunlight into a shade or of a building or overhang, you have to stop and evaluate and tweak your shutter speed and ISO all over again. It becomes exhausting. Now, in aperture priority, you lock in your creative vision, say f2.8 for a beautiful subject isolation. And as you move between the light and the shadow, the camera instantly adjusts the shutter speed and maintain that perfect exposure for you. Doing all this, you never lose a fraction of a second. Now, I know what you're thinking. If the camera chooses the shutter speed, won't my photos end up blurry when the light drops? Well, that used to be the huge drawback of the traditional aperture priority. But when you pair it with modern auto ISO, that problem completely and totally vanishes. This is the key insight that turns your standard semi-automatic mode into an absolute powerhouse. Most photographers think auto ISO just picks a random ISO number whenever it feels like it. But modern camera sensors are ridiculously smart, and when you configure your auto ISO properly, you are setting a strict set of boundaries that the camera is never allowed to cross. Think of auto ISO like hiring a super capable camera assistant. You don't just tell them do whatever you want. You give them strict rules. In your camera's menu, you set three specific perimeters. The first one is your base ISO, usually around 100, and this is for the cleanest image quality. Your second is your maximum ISO, around 6400 or 12,800, depending on how much noise your camera sensor handles well. And your third is minimum shutter speed. That third rule, minimum shutter speed, is where the magic happens. You tell your camera, Never let the shutter speed drop below, let's say, 200th of a second. Now, look what happens when you walk around shooting. You set your aperture to, let's say, f2.8 for a depth of field, but as you walk around, you move into a dark alleyway where your camera needs more light. Now, instead of letting the shutter speed drop to, let's say, 1/15th of a second, which would actually ruin your photo with camera shake or motion blur, the camera is forced to raise the ISO instead. And by doing so, this keeps your shutter speed locked safely at 1/250th of a second. What you've done is essentially built a safety net. You get the exact same depth of field you want, guaranteed sharp motion freezing, and the camera automatically calculates the exact ISO needed for a clean exposure. But what if you're dealing with extreme lighting scenarios like harsh contrast or backlit subjects? Well, that's where the next trick comes in. Now, at this point, skeptics usually say, what if the camera gets my exposure wrong? What if the background is super bright and my subject ends up totally underexposed? Here's the advanced angle that most people overlook. Shooting an aperture priority with auto ISO doesn't mean giving up exposure control. It actually gives you faster control through a single tool, and that's known as exposure compensation. Every modern digital camera has an exposure compensation dial or button, and it's usually marked with a little plus and minus icon. Because your camera is managing the shutter speed and ISO automatically, yes, based on its light meter, tweaking this single dial lets you instantly override the camera's judgment in real time without taking your eye off the viewfinder. Say you're shooting in a backlit portrait against a bright sky and your subject looks a little dark. You don't need to manually recalculate these three settings. You simply dial in a +1 or a +1.5 stops of exposure compensation. The camera instantly adjusts the auto ISO or shutter speed to brighten the frame. If you're in a dark, moody scene and want to preserve the deep shadows, dial it down to a -1 stop. It's lightning fast. You're using one thumb dial to fine-tune brightness on the fly while staying 100% focused on the timing, expression, and composition. Instead of juggling three moving variables in your head, aperture, shutter priority, and ISO, you're streamlining that entire mental process down to two simple choices. That's aperture for creative style, and exposure compensation, that's for overall brightness. So how do you take this system and apply it to your very next photo shoot? Well, let's put it all together into an actionable game plan. Let's recap the ultimate real-world setup so you can program your camera today and instantly feel the difference in your next shoot. First, let's set the camera's aperture dial to aperture priority. Secondly, open your shooting menu and navigate to your ISO settings. Turn auto ISO on and then set your minimum ISO to 100. And cap that maximum ISO at a level that you're comfortable with. For most modern mirrorless and DSLR cameras, the ISO of 6400 is a fantastic ceiling. Third, set your minimum shutter speed based on what you're shooting. For instance, 1/125 or 250 for everyday street photography and general snapshots. 1/500 is great if you're chasing kids, pets, or fast action. 1/60 is great if you're doing static landscapes or indoor portraits where nothing really moves fast at all. Once those three steps are done, your camera is transformed from a stubborn puzzle into an extension of your own eyes. You control the aperture dial to dictate the depth of field. You use exposure compensation to adjust for tricky lighting. Let the camera handle the micro math in the background. The goal of photography has never been to prove how good you are at mental arithmetic in the heat of the moment. The goal is to capture compelling stories, emotional portraits, and stunning light. By stepping away from the manual mode trap and embracing the aperture priority with auto ISO, you stop fighting the camera's interface and start making better photographs. It's faster, easier, and without ever missing a single shot again. There you have it. Mastering your camera isn't about making things harder on yourself just to prove a point. It's about giving yourself the freedom to focus on what really actually matters. That's capturing incredible moments as they happen. By letting aperture priority and auto ISO take care of the split-second exposure math, you can reclaim your mental energy for composition, light, and the story. Now, if this video has helped demystify your camera settings today, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know to make more content like this. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on that notification so you don't miss out on upcoming photography guides. Hey, look, I'd love to hear from you down below in the comments. What's your go-to shooting mode right now? Are you willing to give auto ISO a shot on your next outing? This is Steve, and I'll catch you in the next video.